Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever stopped to wonder where the ultimate power in a country actually resides?
Mm.
Not just who's in office today or, which party has the majority, but the foundational supreme authority, the source from which all other legal power flows.
Yeah, the real root of authority.
Exactly. It's a concept called sovereignty, and it's absolutely fundamental if you want to understand the state, law, and really the whole structure of politics.
It really is foundational.
It sounds straightforward supreme power, but diving into it reveals layer after layer of complexity and tension, actually.
It's definitely the bedrock. I mean, if you don't get sovereignty, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle for how states organize themselves, how they interact, and how power works inside them. It boils down to who has the final command.
Precisely. And that's what we're taking a deep dive into today. We've been working with some key excerpts from a foundational text, An Introduction to Political Theory by O.P. Gaba.
Right. It's a resource that really meticulously unpacks this concept, traces its origins, lays bare its core components, and importantly, its challenges too.
So our mission in this deep dive is to navigate that text, pull out the most important insights, and help you get a solid grasp on the meaning, the history, the characteristics, and the different practical aspects of sovereignty as Galba presents them.
Think of it as getting to the heart of political authority, trying to map it out.
All right, let's dive in then. Where does Galba actually start when he defines sovereignty? What's the essential idea we need to grab first?
Well, he starts, as you might expect, with the word itself, sovereignty. It comes from the Latin word superanus,
Correctness.
okay, which means supreme. So at its absolute simplest, sovereignty just denotes the supreme power of the state, being the highest authority, essentially.
Supreme power. Got it. Simple enough start. But Galba immediately makes a crucial point about what kind of supremacy we're talking about here, doesn't he?
He does, and this is really vital. Geba emphasizes that sovereignty, certainly in its classical formulation, is primarily, maybe most clearly, a legal concept.
Legal. Not just, say, moral or political influence.
Exactly. This isn't just about popularity or having the right ideas or even practical clout. It's about legal authority that is highest and final, unquestionable within that legal framework.
So when we talk about the sovereign, legally speaking, what does that imply? What can they do or maybe not do?
It means, and Goba cites J.W. Garner here, that the state, because it possesses sovereignty, cannot be legally bound except by its own will or limited by any other power than itself.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
It is. Legally, the sovereign answers only to itself. Its own will is the highest legal command. And Goba notes, this is important, that a lot of the confusion and objections around sovereignty pop up precisely when people try to take this concept, which is clearest in the strictly legal domain, and apply it directly, without adjustment, to moral, political, or sociological spheres.
Ah, so the legal definition is the clearest starting point. The ideal form, maybe.
That's how he presents it, yes.
Okay, so legally, the sovereign sits at the absolute top.
Yeah.
What are the practical functions that flow from this supreme legal position?
Well, the basic function deriving from this supremacy is the power to declare law, to issue commands, and to make political decisions. Decisions about public policy, objectives, priorities that are binding
Binding on who?
on all individuals and all associations within their jurisdiction. This power isn't optional, it's mandatory. And crucially, the sovereign has the physical force needed to ensure obedience.
The power to punish, essentially.
To punish disobedience, yes. To
Right.
compel compliance.
And is there any legal requirement for the sovereign to get approval, say, from the people or
No.
some other body?
From a strict legal viewpoint, as Galba explains it, no. The sovereign issues laws, commands, decisions purely at their own will. They don't legally require the approval or consent of any other individual, group, or entity within the state. Now, the text acknowledges that this pure form might seem most easily embodied by, say, an absolute monarch who literally rules by personal will.
Right, you can picture that easily.
But the concept itself is applied universally to the state as an entity. Regardless of whether that supreme power is actually wielded by one person or a committee or, some other structure defined by its constitution, it's the state's inherent legal power we're defining here.
Okay, so it's the ultimate legal authority inside the state's borders, over everyone and everything. Does this supreme power also apply outside the borders? in relation to other states.
Absolutely. Galba presents this twofold nature of legal authority that's inherent in sovereignty. Internally, it's that supremacy we just talked about, command over all individuals and associations within the territory. No one inside is legally exempt.
And externally.
Externally, it means the state's independence. Independence from the control or interference of other states when it's conducting its own affairs or dealing in international relations. One sovereign state can't legally dictate terms to another.
This sounds like the very basis for how countries interact on the world stage, right? International Relations 101.
Precisely. Galba points out that, in theory at least, under international law, all sovereign states are considered equal.
Equal. Even if one's tiny and another's huge.
In legal theory, yes. This theoretical equality exists regardless of their actual power, size, or wealth. He mentions the UN Charter, for instance, is founded on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members.
Interesting.
And the Charter also recognizes the sphere of domestic jurisdiction, meaning there are certain matters considered purely internal to a state, generally shielded from outside interference, even from organizations like the UN itself. That's a direct consequence of external sovereignty.
Okay, so supreme legal power internally and externally.
Yeah.
And this idea of theoretical equality among states, Galba describes this power as absolute. That's a very strong word. What does that level of absoluteness really imply?
Yeah, absolute is key. When speaking purely from the legal standpoint, the concept of sovereignty inherently implies that this power is absolute, unlimited, and perpetual.
Why perpetual?
Well, we'll get to that as a characteristic. But absolute and unlimited because supreme power is attributed to the will of the sovereign entity. Think about it. If a power is truly supreme, it logically cannot be limited by something else higher than itself.
Because if it could, that something else would actually be the supreme power.
Exactly. It's a logical necessity of the definition.
But wait, if it's legally unlimited, does that mean the sovereign can just do anything? Anything at all, however arbitrary or, frankly, terrible?
This is where Galba introduces a really crucial nuance. He distinguishes between the legal attribute and, let's say, practical or moral considerations. He emphasizes that while legally absolute, this power is not intended to be, and indeed often cannot realistically be exercised without some regard for things like conscience, justice, prevailing customs, social values, or the common interests of the community.
So the sovereign should pay attention to these things.
They absolutely should. Galba argues that a sovereign who completely disregards these factors, who acts totally arbitrarily, risks rapidly eroding their own legitimacy and authority.
So there are practical limits, even if not strictly legal ones, political realities.
Exactly. While legally they aren't obliged to consult anyone on whether a decision is morally right or politically wise, and their decisions are legally binding unless they revoke them, acting arbitrarily is just a recipe for instability. It could eventually lead to the loss of that very sovereignty.
So the legal concept is about the capacity for supreme command.
Right. But the practical exercise of that capacity for long-term survival and effectiveness requires considering more than just pure legality.
That's a really key point. Absolute legally, but needing an eye towards practicality and legitimacy to actually work. Okay, this powerful idea, it didn't just spring out of nowhere. Galba walks us through its historical development, right?
He does. He frames it as the concept that really perfected the modern state as we understand it. Before sovereignty was clearly articulated, ideas about supreme power were, well, quite different, often fragmented.
Like going way back. Ancient Greece, Aristotle's mentioned.
Yes. Aristotle certainly discussed supreme power within the polis, the city-state. But his conception placed the ruler's power as being limited by the law, a law that existed above the ruler.
Ah, so the ruler was subject to the law.
In Aristotle's view, yes, which is fundamentally different from the concept of sovereignty, where the sovereign is the source of the law, not just subject to some pre-existing legal or moral order.
Got it. And then the Middle Ages. Sounds like a period where concentrated supreme power was hard to find.
Very much so. Galba describes the conditions in the Middle Ages as distinctly unfavorable for sovereignty developing in the modern sense. Rulers' power was constantly hemmed in.
Hemmed in by whom?
On two main fronts. Internally, by the rights and actual power of feudal lords. They often held significant, almost semi-autonomous authority over their own territories and people.
Right, a patchwork of power centers.
Exactly. And then externally, there were the overarching claims of the Pope and the Church to superior authority, spiritual, of course, but often temporal too, across Christendom. There just wasn't a single, unchallenged supreme authority within a defined territory.
So what started breaking down that fragmentation? What paved the way for a stronger central authority?
Goba points to the dawn of the modern period. Think roughly 15th, 16th centuries. That's when conditions really started shifting. Several things weakened the feudal lords.
Like what?
Well, the Crusades drained their resources and manpower. They were always quarreling amongst themselves. Plus, you had the rise of commerce in towns, creating new centers of wealth and power outside the old feudal structure. And new military tech like gunpowder started making castles and knights less dominant.
Okay, so the lords are weakening internally. What about the monarchs?
Simultaneously, the rulers in emerging national states, places like England, France, were consolidating their power, achieving more internal unification, more centralization.
And they were also pushing back against the church's power.
Exactly. They successfully challenged and eventually pretty much broke free from the pervasive influence and the claims of the Pope. They established the state as the highest authority within its own borders, both spiritually and temporally.
So weakening internal rivals, asserting external independence.
That combination created the fertile ground. The conditions were right for the theory of sovereignty to take shape and be articulated.
And the figure credited with being the first to really formulate it systematically is Jean Baudin.
Yes, Jean Baudin, a French jurist, 16th century. He's widely seen as the first to give a systematic exposition of sovereignty. Apparently, he was deeply influenced by the chaos of the French wars of religion. He saw the need for a strong central authority.
And how did he define sovereignty?
His definitions are quite memorable. The absolute and perpetual power of commanding in a state, and also supreme power over citizens and subjects unrestrained by law.
Unrestrained by law. That really jumps out. That was his big departure, wasn't it? Placing the sovereign above the positive law.
That was the fundamental shift. You see, in the medieval view, law was often seen as something kind of eternal, maybe divine, or based on ancient custom. Rulers discovered it, applied it, but were ultimately subject to it.
Right.
Bodin flipped that. He argued the sovereign is the source of law. Therefore, logically, the sovereign cannot be bound by laws they themselves create, or by laws anyone else creates, for that matter. For any independent political community governed by law to exist, he reasoned, there must be a supreme authority that establishes and enforces those laws.
So the sovereign creates the whole legal order. But even Baudin, he saw some limits on this seemingly absolute power, right? Galbo mentions a couple.
He did, yes. While placing the sovereign above positive man-made law, Baudin did acknowledge limitations based on what he considered higher principles. He felt the sovereign was still bound by divine law and natural law, particularly regarding promises and keeping agreements.
Okay, higher moral or divine constraints, anything more concrete?
Yes, Goba highlights two key ones mentioned by Baudin. First, respect for certain fundamental laws of the kingdom, like the Salic law in France governing who could inherit the throne. Baudin saw these as almost part of the state's constitution, untouchable by the sovereign.
Interesting. And the second?
Respect for private property. Baudin considered private property inviolable, granted by natural law, and therefore, he argued, the sovereign could not tax subjects without their consent.
So taxation required consent. That's a significant practical limit.
It is. So while legally supreme in making day-to-day laws, Baudin's sovereign wasn't entirely free from higher legal or moral constraints or established practices like getting consent for taxes.
Fascinating how even the first major theorist had to wrestle with limits. Who picked up the concept next in its development?
Next key figure Gaba discusses is Hugo Grotius, Dutch jurist, 17th century, often called the father of international law.
Okay, so his focus shifts outwards.
Exactly. His major contribution, as Gaub explains it, was really elaborating the implications of sovereignty for the international sphere. Baudin focused heavily on internal supremacy. Grotius brought external sovereignty into much sharper focus, the independence of the sovereign state from foreign control.
But how did he connect sovereignty to international law? It seems almost contradictory. If states are totally sovereign, aren't they unbound by international law?
That's the inherent tension, isn't it? And Grotius tackled it head-on. He tried to build a system of international law on two main pillars. First, natural law, which he believed applied to the Society of Nations just like it did to individuals. It provided a kind of universal moral basis for state conduct.
Okay, natural law. And the second pillar?
A voluntary law of nations. This derived from the customs and, crucially, the express consent of states, primarily through treaties and established practices.
And that word voluntary is really the key there, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. Grotius made it very clear that when states adhere to international law, whether it's customary or treaty-based, they do so out of their own free consent.
They're choosing to be bound.
Yes. They are not submitting to some higher legal authority that compels them externally. They are voluntarily choosing to bind themselves, perhaps because they see it as rational or mutually beneficial or necessary for stable relations. This framing powerfully reinforces the idea that external sovereignty means a state isn't legally subject to any outside power unless it chooses to be.
So he basically extended moral responsibility to the international sphere, but based it on state consent.
You could put it that way. He added that clear external dimension to Bodin's internal focus, giving the concept of sovereignty a fuller, more rounded shape.
Right. This brings us neatly to the social contract thinkers. They seem to shift the focus, again, more onto the origin and legitimacy of this supreme power.
They are absolutely central to the story, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. Social contract theory became, for a time, the dominant way of explaining the state, and it profoundly shaped ideas about where sovereignty comes from and why it's legitimate.
And Thomas Hobbes gives us a particularly stark view.
He certainly does. Hobbes, writing in 17th century England during another period of intense civil war and upheaval, saw the state as a direct result of people's will, but in a very specific way.
He starts with that state of nature.
Yes, a terrifying state of nature before any government. Gaube describes it as a law of the jungle, where life was, in Hobbes's famous words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A constant war of all against all.
Not a nice place to be.
Definitely not. And to escape this horrific condition, to get order, peace, and security, people, in Hobbes's view, enter into a social contract. And here's the crucial part. They surrender all their natural rights to a sovereign entity, the Leviathan.
Surrender all rights. That sounds extreme. A massive transfer of power.
Hobbes believed it was absolutely necessary for effective government. He argued this surrender had to be complete, final, and irrevocable.
Why irrevocable? Couldn't they change their minds?
Not in Hobbes's system, because any attempt by the people to reclaim those rights, to question or defy the sovereign, risked plunging society right back into that dreaded state of nature, back into anarchy and chaos. The sovereign's authority, once established by this contract, must be absolute and unquestionable in order to guarantee the peace it was created to provide.
So in Hobbes' system, the sovereign has absolute power, yes, but it's legitimate because, one, it was created by the people's contract, and two, it provides that essential security and order.
Exactly. Gaube highlights that Hobbes's contribution wasn't just arguing for absolute power, but providing a powerful new basis for its legitimacy. It's seen as a product of the people's initial rational will, and it serves a vital functional purpose. It works.
Okay. How does John Locke compare? He was writing just after Hobbes, also in England, right?
Yes, Locke, another hugely influential 17th century social contract theorist, offered a very different vision. One that significantly challenged this idea of absolute sovereignty being vested in the ruler or the state.
How so?
Unlike Hobbes, Locke did not believe people surrendered all their rights when they entered civil society. He argued that individuals retained fundamental natural rights, specifically life, liberty, and property, which existed before the state, even in the state of nature, though their protection was insecure there.
And the state's purpose was different for Locke then?
Fundamentally different. For Locke, the state was created specifically to better protect these pre-existing natural rights. The government, or the ruler, was seen more like a trustee or an agent of the people. It was delegated power by the people to serve this specific protective purpose.
So the government couldn't be supreme over those rights?
Precisely. Therefore, the government or ruler could not possess absolute supreme power over those fundamental rights it was created to secure. This is such a critical pivot point in political thought. It shifts the ultimate locus of authority away from the ruler, suggesting it remains somehow with the people, and sets the stage for later ideas of limited government and, eventually, popular sovereignty.
Which leads us directly to Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah.
18th century France, and a key figure in popular sovereignty.
Absolutely. Rousseau, the hugely influential French philosopher, is really considered the foremost exponent of the modern doctrine of popular sovereignty. He took the social contract idea and used it to argue quite radically that the people themselves collectively are the sovereign.
Not a separate ruler or entity they create.
Exactly. Unlike Hobbes, who created a sovereign entity apart from the people, the Leviathan, Rousseau essentially said the people, when they form a political community, become the sovereign.
How did his version of the social contract achieve that?
In Rousseau's conception, the social contract isn't a surrender to a sovereign ruler. It's an agreement amongst the people themselves. Individuals unite to form a political community, and in doing so, they agree to place themselves under the supreme direction of the collective will, what he famously called the general will.
The general will, okay.
The result is that sovereignty is retained by the people themselves, acting in their corporate capacity through this general will. The government, for Rousseau, is merely an executive agent of this general will. It carries out the will of the sovereign people. It isn't the sovereign itself.
And he had a very specific idea about how this popular sovereignty should actually be exercised, didn't he? He wasn't keen on representatives.
No, he wasn't. Galba notes Rousseau's strong preference for direct democracy. He argued that sovereignty belongs to the people and can, ideally, only be properly exercised when the entire body of citizens is assembled together. He was deeply suspicious of representation.
Why? What was his issue with it?
He famously said something like, "The moment a people allows itself to be represented, it is no longer free." He believed sovereignty couldn't be delegated. The people's will had to be expressed directly by them.
Okay, so the people are sovereign through this general will.
Yeah.
Why is that will considered supreme? Why absolute?
This is where Rousseau introduces a really important and sometimes tricky distinction between different kinds of will. This is central to understanding the general will's claim to sovereignty.
What's the distinction?
He contrasts the particular will, which he also called the actual will, or the expression of our lower self, with the general will, which represents our real will or higher self.
Okay, particular versus general, actual versus real. What's the difference?
The particular will is the will of an individual motivated by their immediate, often selfish interests. It's transient, it changes, and it obviously differs from person to person. The general will, on the other hand, is the will of the community as a whole, focused on the common interest. And crucially, Rousseau believed it also reflects the real long-term interest of every member of that community.
So the general will isn't just adding up everyone's selfish desires, like an opinion poll.
No, definitely not. He explicitly distinguishes it from the will of all, which is just the sum of particular wills, often full of contradictions and canceling each other out. The general will is more like the common denominator. It's the rational will that all individuals would share if they were thinking clearly about the common good and their own genuine long-term welfare within that community.
Can you give an example? Galba uses one, right?
Yes, the traffic light example is helpful. Your actual will in a moment might be to run a red light because you're late. That's immediate self-interest. But if everyone did that, it would be chaos, dangerous for everyone, including you.
Right.
Your real will, however, aligns with the general will behind traffic laws, the shared interest in maintaining order, safety, and predictability on the roads. That ultimately serves your own long-term interest in survival and being able to get around safely.
Okay, I see the distinction, and this is where that famous, often controversial phrase comes in. People can be forced to be free.
Exactly that. Rousseau's argument, quite provocative, is that when you act purely on your particular momentary self-interest, your actual will, you're not truly free. You're arguably a slave to your impulses, your passions, and your actions clash with others doing the same, creating conflict and undermining the conditions for everyone's freedom.
So being stopped from running the red light.
Is an example. When the community, acting through the general will as embodied in the law, prevents you from following that harmful actual will, you might feel constrained in that moment. But paradoxically, Rousseau argues, you are not being deprived of your true freedom. You are actually being compelled to act in accordance with your own real will, the will that aligns with the general will and the common good. You are being forced to be free by being brought into alignment with your own higher, rational self and the conditions necessary for genuine, shared liberty within the community.
It's a demanding concept, a very collective idea of freedom, and because this general will is seen as the higher self, embodying reason and the common good, that's why it's considered absolute and sovereign in his system.
Yes, that's the logic in Rousseau's framework. It's seen as morally superior, always aimed at the public good, inherently right. It gets elevated to having absolute, unlimited, and inalienable sovereignty because it's viewed as the embodiment of the common will of rational, right-thinking individuals. It becomes the ultimate source of reason and justice, the very heart of what he saw as classical democracy.
So in theory, the people expressing this pure general will hold the absolute and ultimate power. But Galba as a really important practical note about this, doesn't he? A major caveat.
He does, and it's crucial. Galba points out that Rousseau himself actually recognized that this ideal of popular sovereignty, expressed directly through the general will, is really only truly applicable and workable in very specific conditions.
Like what?
Very small, homogenous communities, places where direct democracy is actually feasible, where everyone can literally gather and participate. Applying this concept directly to the huge, complex, diverse societies we live in today, with representative governments, well, it faces immense practical hurdles.
So in the modern world,
Galba concludes that in contemporary politics, popular sovereignty, especially in the Rousseauian sense, is largely accepted for its symbolic significance. It's the powerful, fundamental idea that ultimate legitimacy and authority derive from the people. But it's not really a practical description of where the actual day-to-day, legally absolute sovereign power is located or how it operates.
that distinction between the symbolic ideal and the messy practical reality seems key. It sounds like applying these theoretical ideas about sovereignty in the real world gets complicated fast and has drawn significant criticism over time.
It certainly has. And Galba moves into a critical appraisal. He starts by acknowledging the concept's immense historical value, of course.
What value does he highlight?
Sovereignty, as it evolved, was essential for perfecting the modern state. It freed emerging states from the fragmented powers of feudalism internally and the transnational claims of the church externally. It really established the nation-state as the primary independent actor on the world stage.
Giving it clear authority within its borders.
Yes, giving it a clear monopoly on lawmaking and policy within its territory. It armed the state with the necessary supreme internal and external authority it needed to function effectively to create order.
So the idea gave the state the conceptual teeth it needed. And the internal logic of legal sovereignty, as we discussed, demands it be absolute, permanent, universal, inalienable, and indivisible.
Right. That's the theoretical model derived from the legal perspective. And legally, the sovereign isn't responsible to any human superior. Its will is final within the legal system it creates. They might choose to observe moral norms or international law, but from that strict legal standpoint, they aren't compelled by an external human authority.
Okay. But here's where Galba brings in the fundamental tension.
Right.
The core problem with trying to apply this theoretical absolutism directly to the real world.
Exactly. The core tension, Galba argues, boils down to this. While authority theoretically implies responsibility, you'd think supreme authority means highest responsibility. In the real world, sovereignty must always be vested in fallible human beings.
We can imagine a perfect, abstract, sovereign state, but power is actually wielded by people.
Imperfect people, organized into governments, and vesting absolute, perpetual, legally irresponsible power in fallible humans. Well, what does the source say that leads to?
Something bad, I'm guessing.
Galba is quite blunt. He says it leads to socially disastrous consequences. History shows, he argues, that unchecked power in human hands too often results in cruel autocracy, tyranny, and oppression within the state, and aggressive, destructive wars externally.
So the very quality that makes the state strong, in theory, its absolute legal power, becomes a massive danger when it's actually put into the hands of real governments. How does Galba suggest we navigate this danger? How do we resolve it?
By really emphasizing and operationalizing a crucial distinction, one we touched on earlier when talking about permanence and indivisibility. It's the distinction between the abstract state and the very real, human-composed government.
Okay, state versus government. Remind us of the distinction.
Sovereignty, Galba emphasizes, is an attribute of the state, conceived as this abstract, continuing legal entity. But the government, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, all made up of transient, fallible mortals, is assigned only definite powers that emanate from that state sovereignty. They don't possess sovereignty itself. They exercise powers on behalf of the sovereign state.
And these powers must be carefully controlled, limited.
Fundamentally, Galba argues that these governmental powers assigned to human agents must be exercised through established procedures and, crucially, with robust, inbuilt checks and safeguards, constitutional limits.
Why? What's the goal of these checks?
To prevent any single government organ or even the government as a whole from becoming omnipotent. To stop them from effectively acting like an absolute sovereign themselves with all the dangers that entails.
This sounds exactly like the argument for constitutional government. Limited government.
It absolutely is. Galba argues that the practical necessity of responsible governance, particularly in our complex modern world, and especially in democracies where the people are held to be the ultimate theoretical sovereign, necessitates a constitutional government.
which is a shift from the original idea.
Yes, it implies a significant departure from that original purist concept of vesting absolute legal sovereignty in a single determinate person or body, like an absolute monarch. He argues that only a government bound by a constitution, subject to checks and balances, can function responsibly and effectively deliver the goods, maintain order without descending into tyranny.
So the practical need for responsible human governance kind of overrides or heavily modifies the pure theoretical idea of absolute legal sovereignty.
That's the core tension Galba keeps highlighting. He even brings in that ancient warning from Aristotle, cited in the source: power and virtue cannot coexist. It underscores the inherent risk when power becomes too concentrated and unchecked in actual human hands.
And finally, Galba offers a specific critique of Rousseau's concept of the general will, beyond just the practical limitations in large states. What's the issue there?
Yes. He points to a potential theoretical weakness or maybe a dangerous ambiguity. Galba argues that Rousseau didn't adequately distinguish between will and reason.
Will versus reason. Explain that.
Will can be seen as a more neutral, empirical thing, simply what people happen to want or desire at a given moment. Reason, on the other hand, is concerned with what is right, just, good concepts that are often complex, debatable, and require justification beyond mere desire.
And confusing the two is problematic.
Galba suggests it is. Confusing them, he argues, pulls the concept of popular sovereignty into what he calls idealist theory, which, historically and potentially, can be used to support absolutism, even tyranny.
How does confusing will and reason lead to supporting absolutism?
Well, if the sovereign's will, whether it's a monarch's declared will or the claimed general will of the people, is automatically equated with reason or what is inherently right, then it becomes very difficult to critique or challenge it. The sovereign is seen as justified in whatever they command simply because they willed it, and their will is reason.
So it short-circuits debate about whether the command is actually good or just.
Exactly. It empowers the sovereign immensely, without necessarily holding them accountable to external standards of duty, justice, or even empirical consequences. This, Galba concludes, can undermine the very democracy that popular sovereignty is supposed to uphold.
So Rousseau had the right ingredients, maybe, but mixed them unclearly.
Galba suggests something like that. Rousseau correctly saw that popular sovereignty rests on the will of the people, their right to rule themselves, and should be exercised for the public good, a duty. But by confusing these two, by essentially saying the general will is inherently the public good, it allows whoever claims to embody that general will to potentially wield unaccountable power.
Which brings us back to
the practical necessity of constitutionalism. Clear limits, checks, and procedures on actual government power, even when the theoretical sovereignty rests with the people.
Wow. Oh, that's a very deep dive indeed. We started with that basic legal definition, sovereignty as supreme power.
Derived from superaneus.
Right. Then we traced its evolution, ancient ideas, the medieval fragmentation, then the consolidation of the modern state, with thinkers like Bodin focusing on internal supremacy, Grotius adding the external dimension.
Then the social contract thinkers wrestling with its origin and legitimacy, Hobbes's Leviathan born from fear, Locke's limited government protecting rights, and Rousseau's radical popular sovereignty through the general will.
And we meticulously examined those 5 key legal characteristics Galba lays out: absolute, permanent, universal, inalienable, indivisible, and the complexities around those, like federalism and the state-government distinction.
Before finally confronting the real-world complexities and critiques, that core tension between the theoretical need for absolute state power and the practical dangers of vesting that power in fallible human governments.
Leading inexorably to the importance of constitutional limits and responsible governance.
Exactly. We've seen how the concept is absolutely essential for establishing a functional state, but also how its application in practice, especially in modern democracies, requires these careful distinctions, particularly that crucial one between the abstract state holding sovereignty and the actual government wielding limited, defined powers.
And Galba's analysis, drawing on this history and theory, leaves us with some really challenging questions to think about, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like if he suggests that the pure legal concept of absolute undivided sovereignty is maybe best mirrored, theoretically, by an absolute monarchy, and that popular sovereignty is primarily symbolic in large representative democracies today, where do you, listening now, believe the ultimate source of legitimate authority truly resides in the political system you live in?
And maybe more importantly, how is that authority, whatever you identify as its source, actually limited? How is it held accountable to prevent those socially disastrous consequences of unchecked power that Galba warns about?
Or maybe think about it from the other direction, picking up on that indivisibility point.
Right.
If the theoretical idea of sovereignty is that it must be ultimately undivided and supreme for the state to function coherently, as those legal theorists argued.
Then how can any government within that state truly be limited? Limited by a constitution or by the will of the people or even by international law without that very limitation fundamentally undermining the state's essential supreme sovereignty? It feels like a paradox.
It really does, a persistent puzzle, right there at the heart of political theory and everyday political practice.
Definitely some powerful stuff to chew on.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the incredibly complex, absolutely crucial world of sovereignty.
Always a pleasure to unpack these fundamental ideas.